Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome LinkedIn's General Counsel, Blake Lott.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. All right, yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LinkedIn Speaker Series, where we dive into inspiring ideas, talk about the topics of the day with people who know what they are talking about, and we are very, very lucky today to have the president of Microsoft with us, Brad Smith. That's right. Brad is someone who I have had the good fortune to get to work pretty closely with over the last almost 3 years since the LinkedIn acquisition went through. I had the pleasure of watching him from afar before that, but I've realized, and watching him up close, he's kind of this mix between this clear-eyed, steely-eyed businessman, this elite diplomat, and kind of philosopher king. So it's really my pleasure to get to share that conversation that I get to have with him sometimes with all of you today, here in the room, in all of our offices, and live on LinkedIn. We'll be broadcasting live from Brad's profile. So without further ado, please welcome my friend, the president of Microsoft, Mr. Brad Smith. All right. So
it's great to be here. I first just want to say thank you for having me.
So thanks so much for coming, Brad. One of the things that we like to do on the speaker series is first we like to ease our way in. So we're going to give you some. I'm going to get up my little. I got some questions here.
Okay. Fire away.
I got some questions. We're going to do a speed round first.
Okay.
So this is something we do. Ready? So you are on the board of Netflix. So favorite Netflix show?
Black Mirror.
Black Mirror, okay.
It's probably not a surprise, huh?
That's a good one. Nickname your parents called you growing up?
They just called me Brad, but when I was in elementary school, I would play softball. My friends called me Hacker because I would just sort of hack at the softball and not have a lot of discipline, more enthusiasm than ability, if you will. So.
I'd say, well, given the book and what's in there, we'll go down low on the Hacker nickname. We'll stay away from that. Choose one, dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Dogs. Okay, favorite ice cream flavor?
Chocolate chip.
Okay. Dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, I've heard of him. Least favorite word?
I.
Favorite sports team?
The Green Bay Packers.
Green Bay Packers, 2-0. There you go.
I grew up in the smaller town next door to Green Bay.
Oh, that's the smaller one, yeah. And last podcast you listened to?
The last podcast I listened to, The Daily. I listen to that almost every morning, the New York Times.
And finally, if you had more time, what would you do?
I would probably do a better job as a Netflix director by watching more Netflix shows.
That's true. I like Russian Doll. It's good.
Okay. I sometimes feel guilty, like, oh my gosh, I haven't watched enough shows before the board meeting.
All right. It's true. The rest of us are using it to waste time, and Brad's doing it to work. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and we got, what do you think, are we warmed up? Yeah, we're warmed up. Okay, so LinkedIn, as you know, is a professional network. As president of Microsoft, I'm wondering, what do you consider your job actually to be, and how do you know if you're doing a good job at it?
I really think of my job as trying to ensure that all of us at Microsoft connect with the broader issues of society. There are people who create products. There are people who sell to customers. There are people who really interact with, say, investors. But if you think about our broader set of stakeholders, I'm really the person on the senior leadership team who's on point, for that. And to try to capture whether we're succeeding. I mean, if we're solving problems that people care about, if we're avoiding problems that other people, might be facing, then we're all doing at least a decent job. And that's obviously not just a statement about me. It's about a lot of people, in our department and in yours too.
Do you find yourself thinking more about the problems that you're solving, the problems that you're avoiding, or how much of your day gets spent thinking on those two, I wonder?
Well, I always believe that you're best served to just be proactive and play offense. But in the world that I'm describing here, playing offense doesn't mean being offensive. It doesn't mean hitting somebody else. It means going forward and just getting things done. And I do find, interestingly enough, that there are days when you can't focus on that. You're having to play defense. But the more you can be solving the problems that other people are worried about in a proactive way, the less time you're likely to find yourself having to be on the defensive.
So it's interesting because, I wanted to talk about, so the book. Actually, I should let you. Why don't you tell us the book, Tools and Weapons? Buy it. It's on Amazon. It's your favorite bookstore. All of these things. It's a great book. I read it. It's really good. But why don't you go ahead and let us know? Okay, what is the most important thing that people should take from reading this book?
Well, the book's title in some ways captures a lot of it. Carol Ann Brown, who works with me at Microsoft on all of the external things I do. And I spent about a year, really putting this book together. And digital technology has become so ubiquitous in our personal lives, professionally, organizationally, institutionally. But like every tool, it is becoming a weapon in certain people's hands. We see this in cyber attacks as just one slice of this. And so part of what we really wanted to do was make these issues more accessible to people. If you think about it, there are people who know a lot about technology, but maybe not as much about the broader policy and public issues that are being created. There are people who are steeped in the world of public policy, but they may not know as much about technology. And then there's most of us. Most people in the world are not steeped in either technology or policy, but they're being affected by all of this. And so we wanted to give people, a book that they would hopefully enjoy reading. It was really important for us to try to write something where people would want to turn the page and keep reading through stories and the like, and come away with a greater appreciation of both sides of this coin and the path forward. Because ultimately it is a book that I think has a level of optimism about potential paths forward.
Yeah, I think that's cool. So you talked a little bit about, trying to be more proactive than reactive, which can be a challenge in the world that we live in today with social media and many other things. I thought, having worked with you, I thought that the company and yours reaction to Christchurch, which was a shooting that happened in New Zealand and was streamed live on Facebook, was kind of a fascinating example of how to think and how to respond. So would you mind just sort of taking that as an example and saying, it happens, what happens next in your day? How do you respond?
It was such an interesting learning experience, among many other things. And we tell the story, I think in a candid way in the book.
Yeah.
We had the coincidence, Carol Ann and I, of being in Wellington, New Zealand, the capital of New Zealand, roughly 12 days after the Christchurch terrorist attack. And if you just think back to March, when that horrific episode unfolded, there were a lot of people talking about, what does this mean for Facebook or YouTube or Twitter? Not as much about LinkedIn or the other services. There are a number of services across Microsoft that people can use to spread this kind of content. But basically, because we were going to Wellington, New Zealand, the topic was unavoidable. So you'll recall, because you were obviously part of this, we thought, well, if we're going, we better have a point of view, because we're sure as heck going to be asked. And we decided to step up and step forward and say, look, this is the kind of problem the world needs to do more to address. We, especially in this country, but not only in this country, have experienced many mass shootings in synagogues, in churches, in schools, in now Walmarts, and in Christchurch in a mosque. The thing that was different about Christchurch was that it really used the internet as the stage. You could argue that not only did it use the internet as the stage, but perhaps the ability to use the internet as a stage and stream it live was part of the motivation to engage in the attack in the first place. And so we really scrambled. And one of the things I'm really proud about was we had about a dozen people from LinkedIn and then Microsoft work together to formulate a point of view that we published in a blog the Monday morning when I first went on Radio New Zealand to kick off the day. But interestingly, as that day progressed, we got the call from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's office asking us to go meet with her. Had no idea what was awaiting us. She had some tough words, not inappropriately in my view, for what we in the tech sector needed to do. But we sat down with her in her office and many people from her cabinet, and she said, what can we do to prevent this kind of thing from happening again, at least to reduce the likelihood that it would happen. And we put our heads together in that meeting. We worked closely with the New Zealand government, which is just an extraordinarily impressive group and very professional group of diplomats and people in Wellington, but really around the world. 2 months later in Paris, we were one of the signatories for the Christchurch call. It brought together 18 governments and 9 tech companies to pledge really concrete steps to address things like, what are the responsibilities of companies with respect to live streaming or taking down content. And we all had different lessons learned, and we're continuing to build on it. Next week, the world will come together again, really, in New York for the UN General Assembly meeting. And so a week from today, there will be events to continue the progress that we announced in May in Paris to put in place a better capability across the tech sector and with governments to address this problem.
I think it's great. Like, one of the reasons I wanted you to tell that story is that one of the things that I've really enjoyed about being part of Microsoft and getting to work with you and your team more is that there is this sort of optimism and faith and wanting to be a constructive part of the solution and doing things like, multilateral agreements. Like, let's look at the things that has helped keep the world strong and safe and peaceful for, since World War II. And there's a belief from Microsoft that we should contribute and we shouldn't just duck our heads. So that is something that I have enjoyed being a part of in a small way. But
the other thing I would say, Blake, to me that was such a good learning, and it wasn't the first time we experienced this, but you always have this tension in business, especially in tech. It's called move fast, be perfect. It's hard to move fast and be perfect.
Yep.
And you have to, I think, in the world today, especially when you're trying to solve problems, move at least pretty quickly if you want to be proactive. It doesn't mean that you can throw quality out the window or fail to think about hard questions. But especially when you have the ability to keep iterating and recognize that no day is like the last day, especially now, one of the nice things about the nature of software as a service is you can make it better tomorrow. You don't have to wait, 6 or 12 or 18 months for the next version to ship the way you did, 10 or 15 years ago. And I think so often when you get a team that comes together, you have to have enough faith in yourself and each other to feel comfortable, because there's risk. There's always risk, especially in something like this. We could have just said, let's cancel that trip. if we don't go, we won't have to talk about this. And there was a discussion about this, and we actually reached out to the people in New Zealand, and not just in the business community, but the government. And they said, no, we want you to come. In some ways, we need the world to come. And when you put yourself out there in a thoughtful way and you're trying to do the right thing, people will at least cut you a little slack if you don't have everything perfect. I thought it was a really interesting example of that.
So what you were just saying about moving fast and iterating, most people don't apply this to legislation. But in the book, you have this thing that I enjoyed where you said, well, we need to set, there's an idea of a minimum viable product that we use as a software company. Get the minimum viable product out there, let's iterate, let's get better. And you said, let's apply that to legislation. Is that a good idea, really? I mean, so.
I think in the world of regulators and legislators and lawyers, it's probably one of the more provocative comments we make in the book. And one of our arguments is that the governments need to move faster if we're going to address the technology issues that are really bothering people. And our basic proposition is, you can take something new like facial recognition. This is, in fact, the context in which we talk about it in the book. And we can say, look, this is brand new. Lots of people have angst about it. Here we are in San Francisco, a city that has now banned its use by the public sector. And one approach would be to say, let's not pass a law on facial recognition until we figure out all of the right answers, which will probably take 5 years. And the counter argument, the point that we advocate in the book is to say, look, we don't know what all the right answers are because we don't actually yet know societally what all the right questions are. But there are some questions we do believe have clear answers. One example is, we think that the fastest way to help reduce risks of bias and discrimination by facial recognition services against, say, women or people of color is to have a law that would require that any company that wants to participate in this market must make its service available for testing. Then you'd get academics, you'd get consumer reports, and then you inform the market and you mobilize the market to put pressure on everybody to get better. And so we would argue that that is a clear question with a good answer, at least to us. So don't wait 5 years to do that. Answer the questions today that we're ready to answer, and then we'll all learn from experience. And there will be other people who will say this is a bad idea, which is good, actually, because if nobody thinks that you have a bad idea, then probably nobody thinks you have an idea worth thinking about. That's just sort of the nature of life. You have to have something that people consider to be relevant. But and like any idea, I'm sure it could be taken too far, and we would be quick to underscore that. But we do feel that we need to start moving faster and solve problems when they're smaller, rather than just wait for them to grow.
So, change topic. I'm going to ask you about the Pope. So there's a story in the book where you meet the Pope, right? And you're talking to him about AI. And at the end of the meeting, he says something to you. What does he say to you? He says,
keep your humanity.
So my question to you is, what is it like when the Pope says to you, keep your humanity? What goes through your mind there?
It was not just that it was the Pope Francis saying it. It was the conversation we had leading up to it, and then it was the emphatic way he said it.
Yeah.
We had this pretty extraordinary visit to the Vatican. This was in February, and we tell this story in the book. And in part, it was framed by an unusual time. The Vatican was obviously addressing quite directly the issues around the treatment of children in churches around the world. It was a little ironic because we were at the Vatican to talk about ethics, and then we were flying to Munich to the Munich Security Conference where you see all these generals. And it was also extraordinary because, as we share in the book, they took us to the Sistine Library, and we saw one of the original Gutenberg Bibles. We saw the letters that Galileo had written to the Pope 150 years after that. And it was all about this intersection or collision. at times between technology and religion, ethics, philosophy, big issues. And then in meeting with Pope Francis, we talked a little bit about the state of the world today. Countries pulling inwards, people not necessarily, perhaps caring as much about their neighbors as they have in the past. And I've done some work on some of these issues, especially when it comes to the protection of refugees and the like. So it was a very warm conversation. I was very impressed by, I'll just say, his sense of humanity, of decency as an individual. So when he said it, he sort of grabbed shook my hand and grabbed my arm and said, "Keep your humanity." Well, I was at least glad that he recognized there was something worth keeping.
Yeah, that's good.
That was good. Could have
I've been worried
worse.
about myself.
Yeah, exactly. But I thought it was good advice. I mean, in a sense, what struck me in the conversation is we are in the business, really all of us in this room, I would argue, we are in the business of bringing technology to humanity.
Yeah.
And his role was to say, but bring humanity back into technology as you do this. That's great advice. I mean, how can we go wrong by thinking a little bit about that each day?
No, I find that the most important thing often in my job, and maybe you have that too, is creating that space in people's mind where they stop and think.
Yeah.
That's I feel like that's 50% of my job.
Well, I think it's such a good point. I mean, I always try to think at the beginning of the day, both about some of the broader sort of values to stay grounded in, and just frankly, in the spirit of being proactive, okay, before people start showing up with the things they want me to do, let me just remember, what is it I want to get done today? But I think in the world today, the pace of change, the pace of communications, being focused and having time to think is one of the hardest things of all. I think, at least in my job, I think a lot of us, perhaps. And I also think that, to some degree, if I have a bad day and I'm leaving at the end of the day and I either, wasn't proactive, or, the thing that I'll worry the most about, maybe I just was short or terse with people. I didn't give them the consideration that they deserved. It's usually because of an absence of time. The worst is an absence of sleep and an absence of time, because that just does not go well together, and they actually tend to go together. The less time you have, the less time you have to sleep. But I just think it's a good reminder, and when the Pope says something, you do sort of remember it. Even if you're not Catholic, I'm not, but I had great respect for what I thought were genuine words of wisdom.
It's interesting because you're talking there about, I think we all recognize that life is moving faster. I mean, Ferris Bueller in the 80s said, well, life moves pretty fast, but it feels like it's moving even faster. But it's interesting to me, in your book, there's such a love of history that pops out. Like in every chapter, it's like, I'm learning about, this railroad magnate, or I didn't know that this was, I didn't know that this was the window in. So, why history? Is it in part some way like a reaction to how fast everything? Is it a small rebellion against how fast everything moves in the world today?
Well, it may be a little rebellion, just because I don't know if there's ever been a generation in the last 200 years that has gotten up and says, well, things used to move fast, but our generation moves slow. It's like, no, everybody always feels like, life has never been harder, the issues have never been bigger, and time has never moved faster than it does today. So what we do is we step back. There's a saying that, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does often rhyme. And what that really means to us as the two authors is, in many issues that we see today, there are historical analogies. And these analogies both explain the views that people have today, and they offer insights. And by the way, they're just more fun to read about, because people love to listen to and read stories, much more than lectures. So it's a way to bring things to life. I also think it's a way to inspire ourselves, because I do think that the challenges we're facing are big enough that we really need some inspiration. One of the chapters that really blended this together in a way that we loved working on was the chapter about rural broadband, because it's fundamentally the story of people today in a rural county in eastern Washington state, the county that has the highest unemployment in the state, and what the lack of broadband means in their lives and the like. But then it's juxtaposed against two stories from the 20th century. What the telephone industry did to bring long-distance telephone to every corner of America, and what the federal government did to bring electricity to every part of the country. And they're both really fun stories. There's some really colorful people, both from the current and prior era. But as much as anything, we're trying to make a point. We've done big things like this before as a country. The technology sector of the day, whether it was the electrical generating sector, the power companies, or the telephone companies, they did it, the government did it. We shouldn't look at these problems a century later and say they can't be done. If the people who came here before us did it, so can we. So let's just start by raising our own ambition level and using history to ask more of ourselves.
I'm trying to think about, so there's Tools and Weapons is the name of the book, and it's all about the technology. But I'm interested about the sort of tools and weapons that you use in your job. Again, we're the professional network, very interested in sort of your day-to-day. So just from working with you, I see that you have some of these. I'm gonna lay them out for you, and then ask you a follow-up question. One of them is, so it's principles, communications, sort of legal stuff, so lawsuits or lobbying, things like that, and relationships. So principles, communications, legal stuff, relationships. Which is the most important for you? Do you spend the most time on now? Has that changed over time? How do you think about those four things?
Well, I wouldn't want to discount any of them.
No, they're all important.
That's the lawyerly answer.
That's right. It's like I'm asking you your favorite child. Right?
But I probably, frankly, spend the most on communications.
Yeah.
Communications publicly and privately. And there were so many things that we learned at Microsoft from what we call our days on the hot seat, which was really in the 1990s, the 2000s, when the United States government and 20 state attorneys general were trying to break up the company. We had these controversies around the world. And one of the interesting things at that time is just organizationally, we were more siloed. There were lawyers, there were government affairs folks, there were communications folks, and it was a good day if they would actually agree to go to the same meeting in the same room at the same time. And to some degree, we, in my view, fell so far short of what we needed to do in order to communicate effectively with other people. Now, the first thing I think is always worth remembering is there's a difference between communicating and speaking. Communication is a two-way street. So actually, the first and most important part of communications is listening. And that was one of the real lessons that we learned. We had to get out and listen more. And listening meant not that you necessarily had to agree with what people were saying, but you had to understand what they were saying. You had to understand why they felt that way, especially since so often what they felt was something about us, and they were less excited about us than we were excited about us. And so that is a big part of what I do and lots of others, including you do. You get out and listen. And then, of course, you do want to share your point of view as well. And you want to be true to yourself, your values, the courage of your convictions. But if at the end of the day you can't explain what you think in a way that is understandable to the people you're trying to connect with, you're going to fail. And one of the interesting things I still find to this day is, even if we have a lawsuit, I am a huge proponent of bringing in the public affairs folks, the so-called PR or communications folks, and making them an integral part of the legal team. And oftentimes the lawyers are like, okay, well, look, when the brief is done, we'll send it to you so you can, know what we're going to say an hour and a half before it goes live. And my view is, look, if you can't, as a lawyer, explain it clearly to them, then you should assume you won't be able to explain it clearly to anyone, even a judge who will be very busy. I just think it's really hard in the world today to succeed if you can't understand people and if you can't connect with them on their terms in a way that they then say, okay, I may not agree with you either, but now I understand you too.
Just as a follow-up on that, when you're saying listening, just wondering, is there somebody who, for you, is either inspiration or something like that person is a really good listener? So,
well, frankly, somebody who really has impressed me is Satya Nadella. I've been incredibly fortunate to work with the three different CEOs of Microsoft: Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya. And they're all just tremendously talented people, in some ways that are similar and in some ways that are different. They all have this enormous curiosity. And if there's one thing I've just seen repeatedly in meeting people, successful people are usually curious people. Now people can pursue their curiosity in different ways. Some people pursue their curiosity by reading. Some people pursue their curiosity by meeting with people. Steve Ballmer was I like to meet with people, and he would really connect so effectively with customers and listen to them. But Satya, I think in part because perhaps having grown up in one part of the world and then lived most of his adult life in another part of the world, I think he has just an intuitive ability to connect with and listen to people on a multicultural basis. And the world is a multicultural place. It's an enormous asset. I've constantly been impressed by it.
So one of the things that, since you're here at LinkedIn, you're streaming on LinkedIn, one thing everybody likes to hear about is themselves. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you a question. So you were part of the senior leadership team that was part of the team that helped basically make the decision for Microsoft to acquire LinkedIn. I'm curious, what's the biggest surprise or most interesting thing from your point of view about us? About the acquisition, right? Everybody wants to talk about themselves.
Well, no, I started at Microsoft in 1993, and I was probably involved in some significant way with every acquisition that the company has made since the year 2001. In my opinion, the LinkedIn combination has been far and away the most successful one that Microsoft has ever made. And that's a huge testament to all of you. But it really reflects to me a lot of lessons learned. First of all, you learn from the mistakes you make in life. So you all should feel very good about all the mistakes Microsoft made before acquiring LinkedIn. We were much more thoughtful. And I give a huge amount of this credit, in part to Satya and Amy Hood, and then really to Jeff Weiner and Reid Hoffman, because it was this meeting of the minds. But to me, there's a few lessons that just jump out so squarely from Microsoft's combination with LinkedIn. First, when you're thinking about combining yourself with another company, of course, the first thing you have to do is buy the right company, acquire the right company. What does that mean? Well, it means focus on an area of secular growth. Entering the phone market in 2013 was probably 5 years later than one might have done it. But even more than focusing on secular growth, really think about whether these two companies make sense together. I think in part that comes down to the mission. And Jeff and Satya have both noted repeatedly how comparable, how almost symbiotic the two missions were and remain. It means having enough shared cultural similarities to make it work. You see over the years that there's almost no such thing as two companies that have identical cultures, but you at least want some commonality. And if you get the right mission combination and cultural combination, then you're on the right path. So first principle, combine the right companies. Interestingly, the second principle in my mind is one that it took us at Microsoft a long time to learn, and I think Satya is really the one who learned this. Do no harm. You buy a company because it's doing something great. Make sure you understand what it is that you're excited about and what it is that has made that company great. We bought other things where the first thing we did is, oh great, now that this is part of Microsoft, let's change what they're doing and have them do something different, because that will more readily enhance our product portfolio or what we need to do next. And sometimes when you do that, you unwittingly, unintentionally undermine that company's opportunity to keep doing what made them great in the first place. So you have to take such care. It's almost like a Hippocratic oath in the world of business combinations and acquisitions. I think the third thing is what has been perhaps the most surprising for LinkedIn as part of Microsoft. Think about how you can use all of the assets of the combined enterprise to not only do no harm, but help the business get even better and get more successful. So to see the growth rates at LinkedIn re-accelerate, almost regardless of how you measure it, and you all know, Jeff is always talking about these, to see that momentum post the close of this deal in December of 2016 is very unusual in the world of tech. And I think speaks volumes about the really thoughtful approach that was taken by employees at LinkedIn and Microsoft in the several months before the deal closed. And just is, again, I think a wonderful testament to all of the people who work at LinkedIn or in other parts of Microsoft. And then finally, if you do those three things well, you have the opportunity to ask, what could we do together that we could never do apart? Mm-hmm. And we are doing things like that. And this is where it's so exciting to see, say, the integration of the LinkedIn service and network with everything from, I want to create a better resume in Word, or I want to know who's going to come to this meeting, to let's just call it, we're still scratching the surface. Mm-hmm. But I think, to me, sometimes you jump to number 4 and you forget about 1, 2, and 3. And you sort of have to take them in that order, and we have. And now you see us trying to do something similar with GitHub, in the same way. And that's why we talk about helping GitHub be even a better GitHub. So I'm just actually incredibly enthusiastic, even passionate about the opportunities that we have going forward when we do bring companies together. And it should, among other things, I think, give our shareholders much more confidence that when we do big deals, and LinkedIn is the biggest one ever in the history of Microsoft, that they are going to be investments worth making.
Great answer. Love that answer. And just one thing, I do think that support from Microsoft when we come and ask for that support to accelerate what we're trying to do from a mission and vision perspective has been very well appreciated. You can see that with the announcement of moving LinkedIn to Azure and the public cloud. The plans to do that, that is will help LinkedIn in many ways and Microsoft. So That is great. I think maybe we'll probably do probably one more question, and then we may move to question and answers if folks would like to start lining up. Maybe two. Oh, well, I've got one that's a more like down the middle one, but I'm going to ask a personal one just because I like it. So there's a story that you've told about when you first went to a law firm, and you had a single demand that you made, and I just love the story, so I wanted you to tell it to people because I think it shows some real insight into Brad the person.
The year was 1986, so that dates me obviously, and I had just finished my first year out of law school. I worked for a federal judge in the federal courthouse in Manhattan. And I interviewed for jobs. My wife, who's a lawyer as well, still is. She's the general counsel of a biotech. And I decided we wanted to move to Washington, D.C. She could move to the D.C. office of her firm. I interviewed with firms, and I got an offer from the firm I really wanted to work for. It's called Covington and Burling. So I called them up and said, I want to come, but I will only accept the offer if you'll let me have a personal computer on my desk. And you might sit there and go, well, big deal. Didn't everybody have a PC on their desk? The answer is no. Nobody really had a PC on their desk unless they were a legal secretary. The legal secretaries had PCs and they were doing the writing, and everybody else, all the lawyers, wrote on a yellow legal pad and then handed it in. And the answer was like, why do you want a PC? We've got secretaries to do the typing. And I was like, because I can write better, I can write faster. And it was a decision that required actually the approval of the firm's management committee. It was a firm of about 250 lawyers at that time. And so the hiring partner said, well, I'll go ask. And I have to admit, in hindsight, with the vantage point of several decades later, I look back and I go, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah.
I can't believe I said that I might say no to the place I really wanted to work because of this. And to me, it's sort of, when I think about what it reflects in myself, Blake, to answer your question, I think it reflects two things. One was just, frankly, a love of technology. And the second was a willingness to lean in and at least take some level of risk.
Yes.
Which I think is key. I always...
About what you believed in.
Yeah.
And what you believed in was a personal computer on your desk.
Exactly. I mean, don't go, don't lose all sight of common sense and good judgment, but lean in and push. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I got the PC, I started the job, and because I had done this, everybody knew that there was this new young associate at the firm who was interested in technology. They presumed that I knew something about technology, probably more than I did. But then when the opportunity started to arise for the firm to do work for software companies, people thought of me because I had leaned in that way. So it paid lots of dividends.
I don't know. I like that story, so that's why that one was for me. All right, so it looks like we have some questions. So why don't we start here in San Francisco?
Hello. Hi, Brad. Thank you very much for coming to LinkedIn and giving this presentation. I think, though, instead of getting your book through Amazon, we should maybe have it on the Microsoft Employee Benefit Store. I think it was in 2018 that you wrote a blog post about mass surveillance and perhaps some of the limits that Microsoft would engage in when it comes to mass surveillance. And one of those things was that you would not offer facial recognition services were to be used for precisely that. A little bit more recently here at LinkedIn, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, was the HiQ lawsuit, where a company had been and has been and is now legally entitled to scrape LinkedIn data for the purpose of creating their business. And I was thinking about these two things, and what crossed my mind is that if people can scrape LinkedIn data, which is meant to be the genuine representation of an individual and their professional persona, then what that means is people can scrape annotated information between names and physical manifestations in terms of their photos. And unlike photos on, say, Facebook, which could be, some shirtless photos of you at Burning Man, this is meant to be a really high resolution quality representation of you. And now it's annotated. Microsoft took down the MS Celeb data set, which thinking this could possibly be problematic. Let's just use that word. So I guess the question is, has the horse not bolted from the gate? No one has a monopoly on the algorithms for facial recognition and facial detection. Maybe Microsoft's are a little bit better than Amazon's or Google's or Facebook's. And now we can't hide that data, the annotated ground truth data of who people are. So hasn't the horse bolted from the gate?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question. I do think there is a horse running around that needs to be tamed. Let me put it that way. The horse in this context and in your question and story is, the risks that the world will rush to use facial recognition for ends that most people, certainly in the democratic societies of the world, would regard as fundamentally at odds with important values. And I think the concerns about mass surveillance are well-founded concerns. And that's why on the facial recognition services side at Microsoft, we both advocated for legal rules and have established principles that we then apply ourselves that go to the uses for which we'll license our technology. I think you raise a really important point as well with respect to the misuse that can result from the scraping of data from LinkedIn. And I think you're right to frame this as a concern that should be thought about in that context as well. And I guess I would say the horse may have bolted from the gate, but it doesn't mean that the issue is over. There are days when you have setbacks. That's what we call a court decision that went against us. It's a setback. It doesn't mean that the issue is over. It doesn't mean that it's a permanent defeat. And one of the things that we've learned in life is sometimes there are fights worth fighting even if you lose, because the principle was the right one to stand up for. Sometimes there are fights worth fighting even if you lose because it's a way of educating the world more broadly to think about things in a new way. And even if a court rules against you with respect to current law, there are always opportunities to persuade legislators to adopt new laws. And it doesn't mean that one may necessarily be able to reverse everything in one case, but it can. It can also mean that additional restrictions can be put in place, protections of people. And to me, that's the fundamental message that I take away from your question. We need to protect people. And we need to use the tools that we have today, and we may need to seek new ones under the law in order to protect them effectively. And we should not for a moment give up on that.
Yeah, and I'd also just add that it's also not just a legal question. It's also a product and technical question. It's an area that we're going to continue to invest in because these unintended consequences that you're talking about are ones that we take seriously, think about, and we need to protect our members. So this is early stages still. It's a great question. It's something that we need to be thinking about, but we're thinking about it across the board as a full company and all the tools that we have. So thanks for asking.
Quick follow-up. Does Steve Ballmer take you to Clippers games?
No. Oh, Brad. Not yet, I should say.
No, I have gone with Steve to a Clippers game. and I'm looking forward to their season in the year ahead.
So this is a question about corporate culture. I really appreciate your comments earlier. Quick context. So I've been at LinkedIn about 12 years and been running the business development function. Early on in my tenure, our interactions with Microsoft specifically, I think, reflected a very different culture at Microsoft. And in terms of alignment with LinkedIn, was not really well aligned back then. Fast forward 9 years, I think that Microsoft's probably the only company I could see LinkedIn coming together with. And so my question to you, as being a part of the senior leadership team, is really, can you share insights of what it took to, what felt like from the outside at least, transform the corporate culture of Microsoft?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And one thing that we always underscore, and Satya is quick to say, is you work to change your culture, and then you have to recognize your culture doesn't stop changing. It's always evolving. To me, if I were to distill the evolution of the Microsoft culture into a single proposition, it is the one of going from sort of a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. It's not to say that people who worked at Microsoft 10, 20, or 26 years ago when I started weren't interested in learning, but it was an environment where you learned more by challenging each other's point of view than by asking questions. And that worked well for some. It didn't work well for many, including many talented people who might have been a little more introverted or might have been a little less interested in, call it conversation as combat. I'll always remember the very first meeting where Satya came in as the CEO with the senior leadership team. What he basically brought everybody was a book, and it was a book about how to pursue conversation and thinking in a way that was, just call it, less confrontational, less combative. I think that started us down a path that we're continuing down. And I love this focus on learn it all, because the best way to learn is to ask questions and be curious about the people around you, the people who may not be speaking, people who may think differently, the people who may be different in lots of other ways. And of course, I think that when you can consider what LinkedIn does for the world, LinkedIn is not just connecting people, but it is opening up that curiosity so people can learn from each other. The one other thing, though, that I think is really interesting, and we talk about it in the book, in some ways the chapter on facial recognition is the chapter where we talk about employee activism, and how much the culture of almost all companies has changed over the last 5 years. I think employees expect to have more of a voice and to be listened to. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's continuing to push us to engage with people in different ways. And you see different companies doing this in different ways across the tech sector. But again, it just puts this premium on learning from each other. It is a very different place today from the past.
Hi, Brad. Thanks so much for coming to talk with us today. I had a quick question about the tools part of your book title. LinkedIn has a tremendous amount of data, and you speak to using it for good at various points in the book. Microsoft also has a tremendous amount of data and has tremendous advances in AI, machine learning, et cetera. I was wondering, going forward, where you see the best partnerships for using that tremendous amount of data that LinkedIn has and the amount of technology and data that Microsoft has for the greater good in terms of whether it's solving issues of unemployment, changing workforce patterns, things like that.
Well, I think, first of all, you had a really helpful start on the answer to your question. And I would highlight two things, and we address both in the book. I mean, one, in the chapter on the talent gap, we talk about skills. And we talk about LinkedIn in that chapter, and the need for all of us to continue to learn, the need for governments to refocus and accelerate some of their skills development programs, the need to harness data as part of the exercise to do that, and the need to make more government data available for that purpose. I think that is one of the global challenges of our time, and it's a huge opportunity, and it is where technology really serves as a tool. We talk about it a little bit in that, even around the world, but I've been really struck by some of the work in Australia, where the LinkedIn team, the local Microsoft team have really partnered incredibly effectively with one of the governments there. But then the other thing we talk about in the second to the last chapter is open data more generally, and the need for what we call an open data revolution, to sort of do for data what open source did for code. And it's a broad topic, but we talk about this in the area of cancer research. We talk about, frankly, the role that data played in the 2016 presidential election and how much we can learn from that. And I think do something that will be important not just to LinkedIn's members, to Microsoft's customers, but really to change the paradigm for how the world can benefit from data. I think that's a great goal for us to pursue.
Thank you for talking about this very important subject. I am really glad you're doing this, and I'm happy to be here today. My name is Krishna. I am an ex-LinkedIn employee. I run an organization called Agile Entrepreneurs, where we collaborate to solve problems by bootstrapping and helping each other. And I have a theory on the big problems that you're talking about and addressing them. And part of it is, I think the world has been kind of built in a certain way, and now we have a lot of legacy code. We need to just start fresh. For that, we need to reimagine everything. But the basis of that is what I like to call second derivative entrepreneurs, where money is the second derivative. The first derivative is the solution to the problem. So focus on the problem first, and only when you solve the problem, money just happens as a side effect, right? And the world seems to be today driven mostly by like, okay, how do I make money from it? And I'm not talking in a non-profit social way. I'm talking about an entrepreneur, an engineer, a technologist, somebody. If I can solve the problem for one person and make $1 million, I would rather make $1 per person and solve it for 1 million people. So I want to scale number of people without ever stopping from solving the problem and just improving on how we do that without ever going down. And so that's my theory, and that's what we've been working on as well, but we are a small shop. I was wondering if there are any such, what are your thoughts on that? If there are any initiatives I can look at, any people I can lean to for help?
Sure, let me offer a couple of thoughts. I mean, first, there's undoubtedly more that I can and could and should learn about both your theory and the way you're applying it. But there were several things that you said that really certainly speak to me. I'll just share one story. I was so struck. This was about a year ago. Carol Ann, my co-author, the two of us were at this meeting in Paris at the Élysée, basically the French White House. And there were 6 or 7 tech companies and people who worked for President Macron and talking about this tech initiative, and everybody was going around the table. And when we walked out, Carol Ann turned to me and said, there was not a single person in that meeting who actually defined the problem we're all supposed to solve. And I was like, yeah, that's a really good point. That was completely missing. And yeah, it was valid then, and it's caused me to think about it more frequently in the months since. I think if you don't have clarity about the problem you're trying to solve, you're probably not going to solve much of any problem. And so that means you need to understand the problem, you need to agree on the problem, and it is a wonderful place to start, especially if you're trying to think about the broader beneficial uses of technology, which of course at one level is extremely broad, but even for a service like LinkedIn, it's all about serving the members. So really starting with that and grounding yourself in it, I think is a great way to begin. If you know what the problem is, then you're going to attract money if it is a real problem, because I think that's the way where money flows in the world of technology. The best even venture capital firms really focus on trying to solve problems that matter to people. So again, I think it speaks to that part as well. There is one area that in another part of Microsoft I'm excited about that would be interesting for you to at least think about whether there's a connection. Part of Microsoft Philanthropies is called Tech for Social Impact. And basically what we took was our technology tools, and we used to just do donations in one place and sales in another place. We brought it all together to work with nonprofits, and LinkedIn does some great work in this space as well. But we now have this fabulous team, in my view, that does things that are similar to what you're describing. I don't know whether it's close enough to make the connection worthwhile. But be happy to, or one of the others of us can give you some information, and it would probably be an interesting thing to explore, because if you are thinking alike, you could probably learn a lot from each other and perhaps even work together.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for one more quick one.
Brad, thank you so much for being here. So you seem to have distilled in this book, and what little I've had a chance to look through, a lot of really important insights into very pressing technical challenges, and distilling a lot of the work that has been happening in the research community and elsewhere. But Microsoft funds a massive amount of research through Microsoft Research. The partnership on AI is right across the street. There are so many resources out there for people who are involved in creating technology to really educate themselves, or even just to get up to speed on what other domains and other domain experts are thinking about. So how do you approach that, or how have you seen other people approach that you think is like a good way to do that? Because there's so much information out there.
I guess I would just conclude by going back to one of the lessons that we shared and we talked about here, the importance of curiosity. I always like to say nobody ever died of humility. Nobody ever died by asking a question that turned out to be, quote, a less smart question. One of the stories we share in the book where this was brought home to me was when Satya and I went and we met with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor for Germany. And she was really using her position as the Chancellor of an extraordinarily important country just to sit down and ask questions. Where's technology going? What's happening in Germany? How's it different from the rest of the world? What are we doing better? Where are we slower? And the world is your oyster in the world today. Especially if you work in a place like San Francisco, but the truth is it almost doesn't matter where you work as long as you have access to the internet and hopefully a high-speed connection to it. The ability to read, the ability to listen to podcasts, the ability to seek people out, that's the future. Maybe it has always been an important part of the past as well, but I think in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, not just in the world of business and as a profession, but just to make the world a better place. There is no substitute for pursuing a great sense of curiosity.
Okay, well, with that, can we please have a warm thank you to Brad. I believe that for those of you who are not on the stream, for those of you on the stream, this will be farewell. For those of you who are in person, there's an opportunity for Brad will stick around a little bit for signing books. Just thanks, Brad. It was great.
Thank you, Blake. No, thanks a lot.
It was great.
Great fun. Thank you. Thank you all.